Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer and welcome to Best Kept Plans. Today's video is going to be a reading wrap up for the year 2022. We're going to be talking about my favorite books that I read this year as well as my number one favorite read of the year. If you're interested in seeing that, please stick around. As I said in my introduction, this is going to be a reading recap for the year 2022. I have been so looking forward to filming this video, to talking about my year in reading kind of overall. I am doing or have been doing monthly reading recaps here on my YouTube channel. So I've been very much looking forward to putting together a recap for the year 2022. I got back into reading this year. In February, though, I started reading very consistently, and I've been reading consistently ever since. And I've been tracking my reading throughout the year in my Archer and Olive Be Hare's collab reading journal. This thing is like my baby. I love this journal. It basically has information about every single book that I've read this year, challenges that I have for myself, my favorite book of the year spread, like all of that kind of stuff. And so in this video, I'm going to kind of take you through some of the stats in terms of like things about the books that I read this year. And then I'm going to talk about my kind of book bracket that I put together to get to my favorite book of the year. So first, I want to talk about how many books I read this year. I ended up reading 100 books in 2022, which is pretty wild. I definitely would not have anticipated that I was going to read 100 books. I don't know if I'll read that many books in 2023. I'll say it, I doubt it. I would be very surprised if I read 100 books. With regards to page count, right? So how many pages did I read this year? Pretty wild. I don't know, to me, I don't have anything else to base it off of, but I read 35,986 pages in the year 2022, which is pretty cool. I also went through my reading journal. I do a recap page at the end of every month, and basically I list out how many books I read that month, page count for that month, quote that I liked for that month, and my 5-star reads. And so going through and kind of adding up all of my 5-star reads for 2022, there was actually 22 of them. So that kind of worked out. And I do want to go through quickly. We'll see if I'm able to do this quickly. I didn't kind of plan for this, but I think it would be cool to just kind of tell you what those are. So in February, my 3 5-star reads were The Hating Game, Love in Other Words, and The Song of Achilles. For March 2022, my 1 5-star read was The Kiss Quotient. For April, my 5-star reads were Clara and the Sun, The Silent Patient, and Ugly Love. For May 2022, I had 2. The Nightingale and Homegoing were my 2 5-star reads. In June, I only had 1 5-star read, and that was Where the Crawdads Sing. In July, I had 1 5-star read, and it was It Happened One Summer. In August, let's see, I gotta find August. Here we go. In August, I had 6 5-star reads. So many that I didn't even list them on my recap page, so let's find them. Okay, Hook, Line, and Sinker, A Cuban Girl's Guide to Tea and Tomorrow, November 9, The Charm Offensive, Love Your Life, and Love on the Brain. That was a lot of 5-star reads. For September, I had 3 5-star reads. They were The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, The Fine Print, and Terms and Conditions. And then for October, I didn't have any 5-star reads. For November, I did. I had 1 5-star read, which was The Match. And then in December, I had 1 5-star read, which was Station 11. So those were my 22 5-star reads for the year 2022. Pretty cool that it ended up working out that there were 22 books for 2022. In terms of the number of days that I read this year, that is something I keep track of. I always have like a little mini calendar on my month pages in my reading journal, and I'll mark off every day that I read. And so starting in February, I started reading the second week of February, and I ended up reading 308 days this year, which to me is pretty good considering we were already like 5 or so weeks into the year by the time I started reading. So that was pretty cool to see. Now, in terms of my book bracket, right, for my favorite book of the year, the way that I put it together is I basically chose my favorite book that I read in each month, February through December. And then I kind of have two books, like January and February would go head to head, March and April would go head to head, May and June would go head to head, and so on and so forth. And that would bring us down to 6 books, I think. And then it would go down after that to 3 books and then my favorite book. So let's start out with me going through and telling you my favorite book that I read each month of 2022, and then we'll go from there. So I didn't read in January at all, so I didn't have a January book. But for February 2022, my favorite book that I read was Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren. I love this book. I cannot even tell you how much I love this book. Newer into romance when I read this, but really, really knew that I liked this romance. And kind of looking back now, this book has a lot of what I've found that I love about romance. It's told in 2 separate timelines. It has childhood friends to lovers. The 2 characters had a time period where they weren't talking, where they weren't speaking. They got to grow independently and then come together in the end. This is certainly a book that has some really devastating moments and sad moments to it, but I overall just really, really love this story. And not only is it my favorite romance that I read in February and my favorite book that I read in February, I would say this is probably my favorite romance that I read this year. Really, really love this book. For March, my favorite book of March was The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. I really, really liked this. This is a really pleasant surprise for me with regards to romance. I loved that the main character was neurodivergent, and I love that we had the ability to see how people react to her because of that, whether it's in the workplace or in her personal life. It was also kind of truly eye-opening and touching, honestly, to see someone who is neurodivergent trying to navigate through dating and finding someone, that was really, really sweet. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I highly recommend. Favorite book that I read in April, I think. Let's see, hang on. Yes, favorite book that I read in April. This one was a surprise for me. I saw this and I really just thought the cover was really pretty, so I decided to pick it up. I didn't know anything about it, and I am so happy I picked this book up because I love this book so much, and that is Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. I don't even know that I could talk about why I love this book so much. There is just something about this story that really touched me at the time that I read it. I just loved it. I just thoroughly loved it. It is so unique to me. It is not a romance. It's a fiction book. The main character is so interesting and unique. And I think the commitment to seeing the world through her perspective, through her eyes, is really, it does so much for the story. And this had me ugly crying like you would not believe, but I'm okay with it because it was so, so good. I really, truly love this. Oh, so good. Clara and the Sun. My favorite book that I read in May is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This is my first book by Kristen Hanna. She's thick. She's a chunky girl, and I flew through this. My friend was right. I read this in 3 days. I loved this book so much. This is such a unique and interesting take on something, on subject matter that I think has been written about quite a lot. So this does take place in World War II. It is a historical fiction novel. I think that so often when we talk about World War II, when we talk about wars in general, we focus a lot on men and their sacrifice, and rightfully so, right? Rightfully so. But I think there's so much interesting story to be told if you focus on the lives and roles of women during wartime. And that's what this book does. And it talks about the sacrifices of women during World War II, what women went through during World War II, what life was like for them. And it is so interesting and thought-provoking and heartwarming and heartbreaking. And I love it, and I highly recommend it. My favorite book that I read in June of 2022 is so good. And that's Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. So I had heard a lot about this book. People rave about this book. So I picked it up. I read it. I loved it. This is such a wonderful story. It is such an interesting coming of age story. It's such an interesting story about a woman realizing, discovering herself, discovering her mind, her power through her mind, discovering her love of nature and her oneness with nature, and discovering what love is for her. And it's just such a beautiful story, and I really loved this. Next, we have my favorite book for July, which was It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. So I read a lot of books in July that were summer based, right? That was kind of my focus in July. I wanted to read a lot of summer stories, and knowing that this had summer in the title seemed perfect for that. Didn't really know what I was getting into when I read this, but I knew it was really popular, and man, I really enjoyed this. This is really, really cute. It's a bit of like opposites attract kind of a vibe, fish out of water story. The main character comes off as so ditzy and shallow in the beginning, and just seeing that the author kind of dive into her character and shed layers of her was really nice, actually. I really liked that character development, and this was just fun, and it was like steamy, and I really enjoyed this. My favorite book that I read in August was a new release. I think this is the first new release. Yes, I don't think any of the ones I've talked about so far had been new releases this year, but my August book was, and that was Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood. I read The Love Hypothesis earlier in 2022, and so when I saw that Ali Hazelwood was coming out with a new book, I definitely wanted to get it and read it right away, and I did, and I ended up really, really loving Love on the Brain. I would say I think I like this one a little bit more than I liked The Love Hypothesis. I like that Ali Hazelwood writes about women in STEM. I know that some people roll their eyes at that or don't like that. I do like that. One of the things I really, really liked about this one is that these two characters know each other but don't know they know each other, and I think the way she went about doing that was really, really interesting, and I liked it a lot. Like, it was a very sweet and I think really good plot device. And so yeah, Love on the Brain, really enjoyed that one. Next book, favorite book that I read in September, is one that I had seen everywhere, had heard was incredible, and was honestly really scared to pick up. I was honestly kind of nervous it wasn't going to live up to the hype. It was so dang good. Everyone was right. It lives up to the hype, and that's The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This book is so interesting. Reading the title, I thought it was going to be about Evelyn interacting and her life with each of her 7 husbands. And yes, it does talk about that, but this book is so much more than what the title makes it out to be. And I think that's so clever. And it's all about drive, and it's all about wanting to make something of yourself. And then what happens when you actually get that? And does it actually fulfill you as a human being? So that was my favorite book that I read in September. In October, and I think this is the only book in my favorite books of each month that I didn't give 5 stars to. So I gave this book 4.5 stars. I really, really loved it though. Genuinely, I really loved this book. And that was When in Rome by Sarah Adams. So this was another new release. This is Sarah Adams' newest book that she came out with this year. And I loved this. This was like a really cute, it had a fish out of water kind of a vibe to it, but it was also like small town romance, and it kind of had Grumpy Sunshine going on. And I really loved this. It was very cute. The favorite book for me that I read in November is actually another Sarah Adams book, and that is The Match. So I read this one while I was on vacation. I wanted something that was going to be light and sweet and easy to get through, and this absolutely was. This was a really cute story. Really interesting in that we have a single dad who's the primary caregiver for his child. We have a female main character who has epilepsy, right? And it really shows just the day to day of someone who has a chronic illness and how they need to go through their life in certain ways because of that. So that was really interesting. And I just really liked this. It was very sweet. It was very endearing, and I really loved it. And then my last book for December 2022, my favorite book that I read in December was the only 5-star read I had in December, and that is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is my first book by her. I absolutely love this. I thought it was really, really interesting. It is post-pandemic. It almost has a dystopian or like apocalyptic vibe to it in a weird way. I thought it was really intriguing. I love the way the characters tied together, and thoroughly enjoyed Station 11. Now, going through and basically kind of having to go like head to head with all these books, and I'm going to kind of lay them down on their side so I can talk about that. Kind of going to the next bracket, we had January and February, which would go head to head together, but I didn't read a book in January, so the next book that moved on was Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren. Looking at my March and April books, The Kiss Quotient and Clara and the Sun, and these two having to go head to head with each other, Clara and the Sun was going to win out on that one. Next we have May and June, and this was honestly the hardest matchup for me, and that was The Nightingale and Where the Crawdads Sing. And I would say Where the Crawdads Sing beat out The Nightingale by a sliver. I absolutely love both of those books though. The Nightingale, so dang good. Next we have July and August, and those were It Happened One Summer and Love on the Brain. And for me, It Happened One Summer edged out Love on the Brain just by a little bit. Then we have September and October. And this one, while I love both of these books, this was not a hard decision for me. Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo had to move on over When in Rome. And then lastly, The Match and Station 11. Again, really love both of these books, but I really had to give it to Station 11. It was such an interesting story. So after that first round, we do have 6 different books here. And I would say that these are not my favorite 6 books of the year, right? And that's like one thing when you're doing a book bracket, that it's not necessarily completely accurate in terms of like favorites making it through. I love these 6 books. I absolutely do, but these are not my favorite 6 books of the year. Now, going down into our next bracket, right? We have Love and Other Words and Clara and the Sun, and this was a very, very hard matchup for me. I love both of these books so much for very different reasons, but there's just something about Love and Other Words that really pulls at me, and this had to move on to the next round. Next, we have Where the Crawdads Sing and It Happened One Summer, and this for me was not difficult at all. Where the Crawdads Sing is so good that there was no way I wasn't having it pushed through. And then lastly, we have Station 11 and The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I feel like this is a really interesting mashup. These books are so different, but I feel like I love both of them in different ways, and so it was interesting to kind of have to think about the two and compare the two and figure out which one I like better, but Evelyn Hugo had to make her way through. So my top 3 based on my book bracket are Love and Other Words, Where the Crawdads Sing, and The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Are these my favorite 3 books of the year? No, they're not. But in looking at these 3 books and trying to figure out what my favorite book of the year is, Where the Crawdads Sing, hands down, is going to get that title. So this is my favorite book of 2022. Now, if I have to take this out of a bracket, right, and really just think about each book individually and which book I read this year that I love the most, Where the Crawdads Sing is that book. It is hands down 100% that book. What I will say though, and let's see if I can get it out of this big pile I have here, is that when it comes down to if I had a top 2 or a top 3, my top 2 is going to be these 2 books. It's going to be Where the Crawdads Sing, and it's going to be The Nightingale. And if I had to pick a top 3, the third book is probably going to be Love and Other Words. So my first and my third got all the way to the final round of my book bracket. I would have to say it would probably be Love and Other Words. It really would. So I love these 3 books. I recommend them, highly recommend them. Where the Crawdads Sing, so incredible. Nightingale, also so incredible. And this one, love in other words, special place in my heart, let me tell you. I have honorable mentions. I know this video is going really long, but I have honorable mentions and I really want to mention them. So some honorable mentions, books that I didn't talk about that I still really liked. Malibu Rising. I really liked that book. I rated it 4.5 stars when I read it. I feel like it's really a 5-star read for me, to be totally honest. I really thoroughly enjoyed that book. The Hating Game, that was my first 5-star romance that I read this year. Really ended up liking that book. The Song of Achilles. I don't know how The Song of Achilles somehow didn't make it onto my book bracket because I love it so much, but I had to mention it. Emma. I didn't read a lot of classics this year. I'm not a classics girl. I loved Emma. I really did. I love Jane Austen's writing. She's so witty. She's so fun. So I had to mention that. My favorite mystery thriller that I read this year was The Silent Patient. This is the first year I've ever read mystery thriller. I read a few. There were some that I really liked and there were some that I didn't like so much. But my favorite, hands down, was The Silent Patient. Kept me guessing the entire time. Did not figure out the ending. Really good. Another book that I absolutely loved was Homegoing. That book was recommended to me by Alex at Artsy Plants for my Instagram challenge. And I'm so glad it was recommended because I absolutely loved it. It's an incredible story. Favorite nonfiction that I read this year? Well, I only read 2. I'm not a nonfiction girl either. I don't love nonfiction, but I did read a couple this year, and hands down, my favorite was Why Not Me by Mindy Kaling. Absolutely loved it. It was a collection of essays, short stories. I really enjoyed it. And one book that I feel like I loved a lot and I just have not talked about enough here is The Charm Offensive. I read that. It was so good. It was a 5-star read for me and I feel like I just haven't talked about it enough. Another one is favorite romance series for me that I read this year was definitely the Dreamland Billionaire series. I read The Fine Print and Terms and Conditions. I read them back to back, I think. I love them so much. I gave both of them 5 stars. The third one is coming out in January 2023. So excited to read that. And then the last book I wanted to comment on was one that I read in November, and it's Lessons in Chemistry. It was so good. I loved that. That was another one that was recommended to me in my Instagram challenge, and I'm so glad that it was. It was such a cool read. I loved the way it was focused on this woman being so determined to make something for herself independently on her own. Like, I just loved it. And so yeah, I wanted to quickly mention those honorable mentions, and that is it. We are done. We are done with my 2022 reading recap. I'm so happy about this video. I'm so excited for you all to watch it. I hope you all enjoyed watching it. And as always, everyone, please be safe. Bye-bye.